everyone. I'm Rosanna Dent. I am a lecturer in History and Philosophy of Science. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all today to the first CLAS Open seminar of the term. And even larger pleasure to welcome Dr. Matheus Alves Duarte da Silva. Matheus is a historian of science and medicine. And studies pandemics, emerging infectious diseases, zoonosis, and focuses on Brazil, South America, and global history. He completed his PhD at the École des Hautes Études in Sciences Sociales, and he joined the University of St. Andrews as a postdoctoral researcher for a project that is not the one he's going to talk about today. But I'll tell you a little bit about it because it's fascinating to give you a sense of his broader work. Which is a Wellcome Trust-funded project called The Global War Against the Rat and Epistemic Emergence of Zoonosis. So that's a project that investigates the history of rat-catching practices as they developed in Brazil throughout the French, British, and Portuguese empires as well, and that looks primarily at the first half of the 20th century. But he's already published widely in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, and has articles in journals that are really central to the history of science, like ISIS and the history and philosophy of the life sciences, but also more broadly, medical anthropology, including 2 co-edited special issues, Rethinking the History of Microbiology, we're going to hear about that a little bit today, and Disease Reservoirs, Anthropological and Historical Approaches. So if you're interested in Matheus's broader work, please look up that great edited work. He's also edited and published a series of other things, but to not take up too much of his time, I'm going to stop there and say that today he's going to speak about material from his submitted manuscript, which is under review, When Plague Connected the World, A New Global History of Microbiology. And I think the specific talk that we're going to hear today is going to focus on connections between Brazil, India, and Europe. Matheus, thank you so much for joining us. I also want to say, to remind you right now, and I will remind you again at the end, that after this talk, which will be about 40-45 minutes, we'll have questions, and then there's a drinks reception on the second floor, which we hope everyone will join us for. So thank you so much for coming. Welcome, Matheus.
Thank you very much, Rosanna, for this introduction, and I would like to thank CLAS for welcoming here and for you to be here, and great to see so many people here, so many friends as well here, so it's a great pleasure. So before I start my talk, I would like to say that the plague in question that I'm talking about is not a metaphor of disease, but is one disease in particular, is the bubonic plague. I will explain this better during my presentation, but I would like just to say this before I start, because this can create some kind of confusion. So I'd like to start this talk with this article that was published in September 1922 at the main scientific journal of Brazil called Memórias do Instituto Oswaldo Cruz. This article was published by Henrique Figueiredo de Vasconcelos, who was a doctor and one of the directors of this laboratory called Instituto Oswaldo Cruz. So this is an article, a different kind of article. Is not a scientific article, but it's a kind of a historical article where Figueiredo de Vasconcelos retraced the history of one vaccine invented in 1901 by Oswaldo Cruz. Oswaldo Cruz was an important doctor in Brazil. He died in 1917. And then this kind of article, it was to introduce his work to the general public in Brazil. And this vaccine is a very interesting vaccine. It was invented in 1896 in India. So Figueiredo de Vasconcelos retraced the history of this vaccine, invented in Bombay, so nowadays Mumbai. Goes to Europe. It's in a way improved in Europe, in Italy, in Germany, and in France. And finally, this vaccine arrives in Brazil. When it arrives in Brazil, Oswaldo Cruz decides to rechange this vaccine or to recreate this vaccine, and he does this during 1 year. So after telling this history of this vaccine, Figueiredo de Vasconcelos concludes that this vaccine is the beginning of a national bacteriology in Brazil. So for him, despite all this global history that I just summarized for you here, for him, this is the beginning of something that he calls the scientific bacteriology in Brazil. So of course we are here in 1922, a very important year for Brazil. Is the first centennial of the Brazilian independence. That's the moment of inventing some myths of the origins of Brazil, or to recreate Brazil, to reinvent Brazil. And this article, in a way, is part of this broad contest of inventing a myth, and science will play a role in that sort of recreation of Brazil. Okay, so 50 years later, in 1976, this book is published by Nancy Stepan, and of course the clue is in the title, Beginnings of Brazilian Science. That's the idea of the book. She is trying to understand the origins of a modern, independent Brazilian science, or a tradition of science in Brazil. This is also a very important moment for the Brazilian history. We are in the peak of the Brazilian dictatorship, with a lot of discussions about progress and modernization of Brazil. And most of the sociologists, by the time, they want to understand the reasons of the failures of Brazil of becoming modern, or of becoming as modern as the United States. But what Nancy Stepan tries to do is different, is to understand the reasons of the successful case in Brazil, when science became successful there. And for her, the beginnings of this Brazilian science is not in the production of knowledge about plague, about the vaccine of plague, because actually for her, as she says in this quote here, this moment of studies about plague in Brazil, this is the last step of what she calls the colonial tradition of science. Colonial here is not colonial in the sense that Brazil is a colony. By the time Brazil is already independent, for almost 100 years, but it's colonial in the sense that George Basala gave to the term. It's colonial because the Brazilians, they were just adapting, they were just reproducing some kind of knowledge that was invented in this case in Europe. So for her, for Nancy Stepan, the real beginnings of Brazilian, not only in the Brazilian microbiology, but the Brazilian science, is not in the studies of plague, but is when the Brazilians start to study the disease that most of the time only exists in the tropical zone or only in Brazil. And the main example of this is the discovery of the Chagas disease in 1909. So we have here a sort of two interpretations. If we follow Figueiredo de Vasconcelos, the plague, the studies about plague, that's the beginning of something new. If we go with Nancy Stepan, this actually is just the last step of a sort of colonial tradition. So the work of Nancy Stepan has been very influential. It became a sort of landmark for history of science in Brazil. In a way, her thesis was criticized, especially by Maria Amélia Dent, who tried to show that actually there was science before the invention, before microbiology, or before the origins of the laboratories that will produce the vaccine in Brazil, the vaccine against plague in Brazil. But somehow, I think, that's my impression, that she creates a sort of a model to think about the history of science in Brazil, which is linked to the idea of the institutions. So it's important to think, so to tell the history of science, we are always telling the history of scientific institutions. And also this idea of that it's important to find a sort of Brazilian science. So here there's a sort of obsession here, which is always the problem of trying to find national traditions or something that is really Brazilian. So what I would like to present here is somehow to go back to the beginnings, to go back to this moment that if we follow the actors themselves, that they consider some kind of important moment, some kind of a new moment. But I would like to develop in this presentation 3 arguments. The first one is that the beginnings of these 2 laboratories that we will be talking about, Butantan and Manguinhos, one in São Paulo and the other in Rio, actually were part of a global conjuncture. which is the third plague pandemic. I'll explain this later. Well, that's my first argument. My second argument is that the production of knowledge on plague in Brazil was never totally Brazilian or national. So in a way, I'm agreeing with Nancy Stepan here. But actually I'm going one step forward and try to understand the production of knowledge on plague in Brazil as the effect or as a result of a transnational exchange. And my third argument is that the knowledge that was crafted in Brazil on plague, that is the result of these circulations and international connections, this knowledge is not only located in Brazil. If we follow this knowledge outside of Brazil, we can see that the Brazilians or actors working in Brazil, they managed to circulate the knowledge they were inventing in Brazil outside of Brazil. So here is to show my purpose here is not only to examine the transfer or the diffusion of knowledge from Europe to Brazil, or the adaptation, the craft of new knowledge in Brazil, but actually to go beyond that and to try to understand what happens when the knowledge craft in Brazil circulates to other parts of the world. So to understand this circulation, so let me just explain to you this conjuncture that I'm talking about, which is the third plague pandemic. So as I told you at the beginning, plague in English and in Portuguese and in many other languages is both a metaphor of disease, but one disease in particular, which is the bubonic plague. Or actually, is a disease caused by a bacillus. This bacillus nowadays is called Yersinia pestis, and the main clinical manifestation of this disease is the bubonic plague. But we can also have the pneumonic plague, both caused by the same microbe. This disease is linked to rats and rodents. They are the main reservoirs and spreaders of this disease. We still have these microbes circulating among animals and also among humans. So just to give you an example, Peru is still a hotspot of plague nowadays, but also California. Oh. California, Congo, Madagascar, those are the main foci of plague in the world. In Brazil, the last case of plague was in 2005. So the last death was in 1985. So we're talking here about a disease that still some kind of considered nowadays a more tropical disease, but important disease is a disease that is transmitted to humans mainly by the bites of the fleas. So the fleas, they'll get infected by biting the rats, and then they will transmit to humans this microbe. We usually think about plague as a medieval disease. This is disease that is behind the Black Death in the end of the Middle Ages. But actually, it was in the 20th century that this disease became global. So it's at the end of the 19th century that we have this that later was called the third plague pandemic, which started in Hong Kong and really spread around the world. Didn't touch Europe too much, but we have outbreaks here in the UK. In 1899 and 1900 in Glasgow, for example. This is one of the last cases, but the last outbreak in the UK is in Suffolk in 1910, so not far away from where we are here. And this pandemic is especially important for the history of, for the social history of India, because it killed more than 15 million people there. Outside of India, the numbers are different, and my idea is not to compare, but it's to show the interactions between these spaces. And it's during this pandemic that the idea of pandemic is in a way invented, or there is a visualization of this pandemic, or of the idea of pandemic for the first time. That's the argument of Christos Linters, who was a fellow here at Crash, and is also my boss, so yeah. Enough nod to him. So that's the first part of my argument. There is a conjuncture, there is a kind of a global pandemic that is caused by the same microbe, and then it's happening in different parts of the world at the same time. But actually what will, in a way, create a sort of common horizon for the actors is this science, this new science, which I will be calling here microbiology. In English we usually use microbiology or bacteriology. In Portuguese it was the same. But I'm using here the original term, which is in French, because it was invented in France, this new science. And the etymology of this in French, is the microbiology, so the science of microbes. So what are microbes? The microbes are these organisms that you cannot see at naked eye. Some of them could be seen by the microscope, but others we cannot see them, or at least at that time. So viruses at that time, they were considered microbes. So this new science emerged at the end of the 19th century, is one of these symbols of modernity, of progress, especially, and also for the French, this was a symbol of the French science upon the world. And what is new with this science is not only that it's possible to identify a microbe, but also to manipulate these microbes to create new things. And at the end of the 19th century, this science will be split into three main branches. One is the industry, so to use the microbiology, for example, to produce beer, milk, wine by using the process of pasteurization. There is also a veterinary aspect of this, and there is also, for sure, the human aspect of this, so to prevent and treat human disease. So that's my point here. And when we look at this part of microbiology, so how microbiology could improve the life of humans, the main symbols of this new science was the vaccines and the sera. So after COVID, I don't think I need to explain what a vaccine is, but I think it's important to talk about the serum, because this is something that was probably, that is forgotten in the history of medicine, but this was the main way to fight infectious disease or to treat infectious disease until the arrival of antibiotics. So until the Second World War, these products were the main symbol of this modern science, or this new science. Serotherapy was invented at the end of the 19th century in France and in Germany in a collaboration and also in a competition between researchers from the Pasteur Institute in Paris and Robert Koch laboratory in Berlin. The first serum to be invented that really saves lives is the serum against diphtheria. Diphtheria was a very important disease here in Europe. It was a disease of the Industrial Revolution. And after the invention of the serotherapy, the case were almost, the deaths by diphtheria in Europe, they almost disappeared. So after 1894, there is a sort of idea that microbiology could save the lives of everyone in the planet, or at least in Europe, by producing new sera. And when plague emerged as a new pandemic in Hong Kong in 1894, there is the idea that this new science will be able to invent a serum to fight this disease. And then it happened. In 1895, so 1 year after the pandemic, the Pasteur Institute managed to invent a new serum against plague. And this is the object that you have here. I took this photo, so this is a serum from 1906. So it's a kind of more than 100 years old, this product here. But after all, what is a serum? So to give you a very brief explanation what a serum is the liquid part of the blood rich in antibodies. So it's something that is used to treat someone. So a vaccine is usually given to someone to prevent a disease. The serum was invented to treat a disease. So it was given after the infection. So the idea behind the serum, and here is a photo of the production of serum. So the idea behind the production of these products, it was the following. So it was usually the doctors would use a horse, but it could also be other animals, could be a dog, could be a rabbit, but usually you want a big animal because you want to extract the blood from the animal. So you need a big animal so to get more blood. So the idea is you infect the horse with the disease that you want to treat, a human. So what happens is, after that the horse is injected with this disease, the horse will produce antibodies against the microbe. So in the case of plague, they would inject the horse with the plague microbes for 5 months. So imagine, during 5 months, they would be injecting the horse every week with a new injection of the plague bacillus. After 5 months, the horse would have produced, so in its blood was full of antibodies. So they would extract the horse, the blood, they would bleed the horse. But here's not to kill the horse, of course. The horse will become a kind of a factor. So every time that they would bleed the horse, they would extract something like 5 liters. And from this blood, you could produce the sera. So the sera is something very, I think it's complicated for us to understand nowadays, because actually what I showed you here is just the blood of horse, full of antibodies, that they would give to someone who was dying of plague. So we don't have these anymore, but actually we do have, if you are bitten by a snake in Brazil, for example, this will be the method 232. It's still a sera. That's how we treat snake bites, but not plague anymore, because we can treat plague with antibodies. So in the second part of my presentation, I'd like to follow 3 actors and 3 sera as they circulate between Brazil, India, and Europe. So I'll start with so I will follow 3 actors here. The first one is an Italian doctor who goes to Brazil. His name is Camillo Terni. The second one is Vital Brasil, the director of the Butantan Institute in São Paulo. And the third one is the hero of Brazilian science, Oswaldo Cruz, that we met at the beginning. So just to give you an introduction of the history of plague in Brazil. So plague arrives in Brazil in 1899, in October 1899, probably coming from Porto, in Portugal. And it arrives in Santos, which is the biggest port of Brazil to export coffee. In 3 months' time, plague reaches the city of Rio de Janeiro, the capital of Brazil, and so plague is at the beginning of at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. Plague is in the 2 main ports of the Brazilian nation, and this is a problem because the other countries, they will impose quarantines against the Brazilian ships leaving these ports. So to face this crisis, the Brazilian government creates in the city of Rio what they call laboratories de Manguinhos, so the Manguinhos laboratory that will become the Fiocruz, the Fundação Oswaldo Cruz nowadays. And in São Paulo, the state of São Paulo creates the Butantan Institute. So both, they have the same goal, which is to produce the serum against plague. Okay? In December, at the end of 1900, plague disappears from São Paulo and recedes in Rio, but until the end of that year, it kills almost 300 people. These are the official numbers, of course. We know it's quite complicated to know if this is the real number of people who died of plague, but this is the official number. And then so from 1901 onwards, plague is an infectious disease in Rio, but no more in São Paulo. So it's just to give you here the context of the circulation of these objects. So it's at the beginning of the outbreaks in São Paulo and in Rio that this strange character arrives in São Paulo. And I put there this unknown famous professor arrives in Brazil because that's the way that he is described in the Brazilian press. The Brazilian press says, we have here with us a very famous professor from Italy, but nobody knows about him and what he does, what he has published. And some Brazilian doctors, including Oswaldo Cruz and Vital Brasil, they both think that he's a charlatan, actually. So this guy is there just to, in a way, to steal some money from the Brazilian government. But who is this guy after all? So, according to the Brazilian press, Camilo Terni is a doctor he's the director of a laboratory in Messina, so in Sicily, who in 1899 invented a new vaccine and a new serum against plague. So Sicily is not far away from the focus of plague in the East, no, in Asia, in India and in China. But there was no plague there at that moment, in 1899. So he invented something, but he could not use this product in humans to know if it would work or not. So when he knows that plague arrived in São Paulo, he decides to go to São Paulo. We know at that time there's a lot of millions and millions of Italians going to Brazil at that moment, especially to the state of São Paulo, so it's not something unusual for Italians to go there, including doctors going to São Paulo. And it's very interesting because in one document he says that he is in Brazil because the Italian government sent him there, so to study the plague, to know if his vaccine and serum can work against plague, so he can use this in Italy in the event of plague arriving in Italy or in Sicily. But in another document he says that the Brazilian government invited him to go there. So there's a lot of confusion and never managed to know what is the truth behind that. But the important is that this guy arrives in Brazil in a moment of crisis, and the Brazilian government sees the opportunity and says, look, because we have this very famous professor here, let's give to him, let's improvise a laboratory where he can produce this serum. So here, I really like this photo, which I know that's not very good to see, but I think it gives us a sort of idea of the improvisation of this laboratory. So Camilo Terni is this guy here in the middle with the red circle is showing, and if you can see, he's not exactly looking at the camera. There's another guy that's completely oblivious of the guy taking a picture. Then there's some animals there. There is the horse, because you need the horse to produce the serum. Here, there is a kid, which seems to be riding a goat or a cow. No, so this is the first. So for me, this is the beginning of the Brazilian science, if you want. Or at least this is the beginnings of the production of serum in Brazil. So that's the first laboratory. It's not Manguinhos, it's not Butantan. It's this one that was an improvised laboratory in the hospital where the plague case were being sent in Rio. It's the hospital of Paula Cândido, so it's in the city of Niterói. So if you know the geography, Niterói is a city that faces Rio, and I'm from Rio. We have this joke that is the best thing in Niterói is the view, because you can see the city of Rio from there. And this hospital was there in this part of the where you can really see the city of Rio. So it's totally improvised, but it's there where this Italian, coming from Messina, that nobody knows about him, but we know that he had been in India before, and apparently he was. It's thanks to the fact that he had been to India, where is the hotspot of plague in that moment, that he learned about plague, that he learned about the treatment against plague, and he brought this to Brazil. So during this first year of plague in Brazil, is the serum is produced in that laboratory here, and it works. The mortality of plague in Rio at that moment is 20%, which compared with India is much better, because in India the mortality of plague among those that were treated by the serum was 85%. So 20%, it was quite good. So after his mission in Rio, Camilo Terni decides he needs to go back to Italy, and when he arrives in Italy, the first thing he does is to go to the British embassy in Rome, and he offers his serum and himself to go to India to treat people in India with this serum that he was using in Brazil. The British government in a first moment says they don't want to accept this offer because they need to know if the serum work or not. So they ask him to write a report about plague in Brazil. And this is a very interesting document that I found in the India office. So imagine this. So this Italian is in Rio. He writes about plague in Rio, and this report is sent from Rio to Italy and from Italy to Calcutta, and then back to London after the end of the British Empire, where we can find this. So it's a document that describes the outbreak of plague in Rio, but also tries to convince the India office or the British government to accept this offer of serum. The British government will accept, and Terni will send more than 1,000 flasks of serum to India. So here we have this first example of this object that is circulating from Italy to Rio, being used in Rio and then going straight away to India. But before I can tell you what happened with this serum, I would like to tell you about the second object and this guy. So this is Vital Brasil, the director of the Butantan Institute. He became very famous because he discovered a way to produce a serum against snake bites. That's why he's holding that snake there. But before he invented this serum against snake bite, he created a new serum against plague. And this serum was used for the first time in São Paulo. And in an outbreak in a city in the state of Rio de Janeiro called Campos. And here we have this document that describes the use of the serum in Campos. And this is a very interesting document because the doctor who is in charge of testing this object in São Paulo, which is someone who works with Vital Brasil, he makes a comparison between the case of plague, the number of cases in India and the number of cases in Brazil, the mortality in India and the mortality in Brazil, and compare these two numbers. He shows, or he argues, that the serum invented in the Butantan is not only different from the European serum, but is much better. So here we have a discourse is not only the adaptation of science, but it's the invention of something that is better, and is better not only in Brazil, but it could be better around the world. So Vital Brasil, he will take this idea that the serum that he invented and he's using in São Paulo is better than its counterparts, and he'll do the same thing that Terni. He will send his serum to India. So for this, he used the network of the British Empire. He's a friend with a doctor, a British doctor working in São Paulo, that he used this doctor to convince the British government to test the serum that was created in São Paulo in Mumbai. This happened during 2 years. In the first year, it's just 36 flasks that are sent from São Paulo to India. But in 1903, Vital Brasil sends to India 600 flasks of serum. And if we compare this, if we look at that document, actually, he sent in 1903 the same amount of serum to São Paulo and to Bombay. So for me, this is something unique, and it was a little bit overlooked by the historians of science, because here we have clearly a Brazilian in São Paulo. This is just the third year of this laboratory, and instead of trying to create connections with Rio or with Europe, what he's trying to do is to use this opportunity created by the plague pandemic to, in a way, create some sort of connections with India. And then that's the moment that the two stories, they will meet. So Terni, he did the same. So the laboratory in Messina sent 1,000 flasks to Bombay. The laboratory in São Paulo did the same, and both using the argument that this object worked in Brazil. So it's the argument of the efficacy of this object in Brazil that allows both actors to try to act upon the Indian context. So the guy who will be in charge of testing these objects is Valdemar Haffkine, a very important actor at that moment, who invented the first anti-plague vaccine. And he was not a medical doctor, so he's not exactly testing the two objects, but he's in charge of the trials. He is the director of the Plague Research Laboratories, which was the main laboratory in Bombay to study the plague. And to test both objects, he used a very modern thing, or what we would consider modern nowadays. He creates a sort of controlled trial. So with the two sera that he received from Brazil, he will give one part to what he calls the serum case, and another part of patients, they are not treated with the serum, they are called a control. And you can see that that's the way that that's his words here, is the idea of a control. So this is very new for the moment. In Brazil, nobody was doing this, but also nobody was doing this in France or in the UK at that moment. So the way that doctors were showing the efficacy of an object at that time, they would be comparing the mortality among the treated with a kind of a general mortality. Whereas here is really the idea of that we can compare, and of course, this is linked to the fact that Bombay is a colony, and you can use the bodies of the colonized people in that sense. In other parts of the world, it would be much more complicated than that. So when Haffkine does this and he compares, what he finds, is that actually these objects, they don't work very well. They are just useless. And I know it's a little bit anticlimactic here, but what I want is precisely this. It's not the beginnings of Brazilian science is a failure, but it's not. I mean, it was a failure for the actors themselves, but I think it's important to reflect about this. And in this document here, so signed by and printed by the British government in India, a few sera are compared there, including these two sera from Brazil. And the idea is that we need to start anew the production. We need to start anew the study of serotherapy, because this didn't work. This has a huge impact in India, which is the main hotspot of plague. This, in a way, will prevent the production of sera in India for 20 years. But it will also create some kind of international effects. For example, in the Butantan, we can see that Vital Brasil tries to change and to improve the Butantan serum after the conclusions in India. But I never found a clear response from Vital Brasil to Haffkine. On the other hand, I found in the archives of Haffkine, which are in Jerusalem, this letter from Terni, where Terni tries to explain why he thinks the same serum that was produced by him and it was tested in India and in Brazil almost at the same time, they show such a different result. So he has a few hypotheses for that. One is that in Rio, he was producing the serum there, whereas in Bombay, it took 6 months to the serum to arrive there. So there is a problem of freshness. Also because in Rio, he could inject this in a higher quantity, whereas in India, there was a sort of shortage. But then he also advanced another hypothesis. Maybe the plague is not the same. Maybe plague is much more violent in India than in Brazil. Why? We don't know. But maybe there is a difference here. So for me, here there's a sort of a discovery of the limits of this new science, a science that always, or that the discourse of the science, of those that practice this science, was the universality. Whereas here is a discovery of the limits and of the particularities of microbiology. But what is interesting that Haffkine replies to Terni. He replies in a very strange way. He doesn't say, in a way, discuss the hypothesis of Terni about the problems with of this difference between India and Brazil. But actually, he asks Terney about, he wants more information about Brazil. He wants to know what is going on in Brazil. By that time, Hafkin is no more in India. There was an accident with the vaccine that he invented. Some 20 people died in the north of India, and then he was sacked from his job, and he went back to Europe. So at this time that he's replying to this letter, he was in Paris, and then he moves to London, and he says like that. So, and he's very curious to know what's going on in Brazil, because someone told him in Paris, there is a new serum in Brazil, not the one that he tested, that was from São Paulo, but there's a new serum in Brazil that gives a better result. And he wants to know if Terney knows more about this serum, because he thinks maybe this object is the solution for the problem in India. But he says, maybe not. And then he advances a sort of racial argument. For him, actually, the difference that we have between India and Brazil is because the Brazilians are more Europeans than the Indians. We have more whites in Brazil than we have in India. Of course, Hafkin didn't know about Brazil, have never been there. He had no idea of Rio and of the population of Rio. But that's his hypothesis. And of course, he doesn't talk about the serum here, but for me, he's talking about a third serum, which is the Manguinhos serum. And then we finally can meet Oswaldo Cruz. So I put him in the end on purpose, so not to start with him, but to end with him, because we usually start the history with him. So Oswaldo Cruz, he's the director of the Manguinhos laboratory. He had studied in the Pasteur Institute, and he had also invented a serum that was used in the city of Rio de Janeiro. But as I explained to you, different from São Paulo, plague is a problem in Rio de Janeiro for at least 1 decade. And because it's a problem, there is no way to send this serum abroad. We need to use all the serum that Manguinhos produce to treat the case in Rio de Janeiro. Of course, this prevents these sort of connections that Vital Brasil could do. But this allowed Oswaldo Cruz to do something new, which was to create this sort, not himself, he used his students to do that, but to create this sort of statistics or tables where it's a kind of they are annual statistics of the use of sera in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And if we look at these tables, they show, in this one here, it's better to see, so they show the reduction of mortality among those that are treated by the serum. So here we have a different way of constructing the proof of the efficacy of the object. We just saw that Hafkin will compare sera case and control case. What Oswaldo Cruz is doing here is he's not doing any control. He's just constructing this sort of annual statistics. So it's a different way of proving something, of constructing, or to construct the proof of the efficacy, which is to show an annual reduction. And this matches exactly with what Hafkin was saying. In Brazil, they are not making controls. They are giving the serum to everyone. And so Hafkin has never been to Brazil, as I said. So how he could know about what's going on in Rio that he was so curious about? Actually, because he was in Paris at that moment, and these statistics created in Rio, they were circulating to France. They were being published in French journals. And also, from 1901 until 1905, there was a scientific mission of the Pasteur Institute in Rio studying the yellow fever. So they were not studying plague, they were studying another disease. But they were very curious about the treatment that Oswaldo Cruz was doing there with plague. So for me, that's my hypothesis. That is thanks to the circulation of these statistics that Hafkin knows what's going on in Rio. And especially because he was a friend, Rifkin was a friend with this doctor here, Edouard Dujardin-Baumet, who was in charge of producing the serum, the anti-plague serum at the Pasteur Institute. So this guy is the main reference for the production, for knowledge on the treatment on plague in Europe. He's a friend of Rifkin, but he's under attack because the product that he is producing is under criticism in different parts of the world, including in India. So to defend the serum that was invented in France, Dujardin-Baumet will use a lot of statistics where he shows that outside of India, the serum worked. When we look at for example, this was published in 1909, but a similar statistics like that was published in 1906. So when we look at that, we have something like 20 or 25 entries here. They show different places in the world: China, Argentina, Chile, Madagascar, and so on. But all of these is about Rio de Janeiro. But actually, I try to construct a kind of a graphic here, but so actually, it's global, but more than 65% of the numbers are coming from Rio de Janeiro. So what we have here is the construction of the proof of the efficacy of these objects around the world, but with just one city. Or this city is the city that really shows that this object can work. And this is the way to counterbalance the opinions that are coming from India. So if we compare Dujardin-Baumet's conclusion that the serotherapy is the only drug to fight plague with the conclusion of the doctors in India, this is the opposite. But my point is, just to construct this sort of proof, they need to rely upon data coming from Rio. And data coming from Rio about treatments made by Brazilians and with objects made by Brazilians. So after this moment of entanglements, exchange, and circulations, plague disappears from the main cities of Brazil, but not from the hinterland. As I told you, the last case in Brazil, it was in 2005. So and especially in the 30s and 40s, plague was a real problem in the sertão, in the backlands of Brazil. But in the 20s, plague in a way disappeared from the coast. And because plague disappeared from the coast, the anti-plague serum is no longer an important object. Because it's no longer an important object, there's no longer this sort of exchange between Brazil, India, and Europe, having the anti-plague serum as its center. So that's why in 1922, Figueiredo de Vasconcelos can reread the history of the fight against plague in Brazil as the beginning of the Brazilian science, because this was a kind of a success, because at that moment plague is no more. Plague is no longer a problem in Brazil. So to conclude, I hope to have showed to you a more sort of nuanced history of these two laboratories in Brazil, Manguinhos and Butantan. Not a sort of celebratory history, but a history that takes also in consideration the limits of the science, the challenge that these actors they face. I hope also to have showed that there is not a sort of unidirectional transfer of technology from Europe to Brazil, but it's much more complex than that. And we can see that the Europeans also took things from Brazil, as the example of the statistics, and that the history of this very important moment for the history of science in Brazil is a complex history, is a complex moment of entanglements and exchange and controversies that will, in a way, connect and put together actors in India, Brazil, Italy, and France. And finally, I hope also to have tried or to convince you that this is a kind of a more complex history of microbiology and a global history of microbiology. And in this history, the actors in the south, in this case in Brazil, they also managed to invent a new knowledge that produce effects in the north or in other parts of the south. So thank you very much.